Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of an Involved Review. I am James Caleb Kitchens. I am joined today by my co-host from the Stovall Wrestling Network, Caleb Stovall. Welcome back to the show.
What's up, man?
And once again, our very first guest on Involved Review, I'm joined by the ace of professional wrestling, superhero homie Q, Quentin Ace Ficklin. What's going on, Ace?
What's going on, my friend? I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, man, and you can find either one of these guys outside of this podcast. You can find Caleb Stovall on the Stovall Wrestling Network. That's available pretty much anywhere that you can find a podcast. He occasionally takes a break from watching wrestling to do a podcast about wrestling, and um, and then as far as superhero homies goes, you can find that pretty much anywhere on the planet that you can find podcasts. It is not available anywhere that Veggie Tales are sold. Um, so yeah,
This is on the roast.
I gotta get all the humor out of the way uh, because there won't be any in this episode. So today,
Oh
folks,
yeah,
we are covering. This is probably going to be the darkest and probably most sensitive episode of this program ever. So it is not going to be for the faint of heart. And
one
if
of
you've
them.
exactly, and if you've seen the episode that this is going to be based around, then you absolutely know that. So today, we are going to be talking about this is part two of our Dark Side of the Ring Benoit tragedy series. So part one we aired last week. You can go back and check that out. But definitely, if you're watching this episode, you need to have seen both the Benoit part one and Benoit part two episodes of Dark Side of the Ring to really understand and grasp what we're talking about and where we're coming from. If you're familiar with the events outside of the episode, you may still get something out of this, but you definitely, if you want to get the most out of it, go check those out. And those are by Vice, and they're available on YouTube, Google Play, Hulu, and several other places. So go check those out. And before we get into it here, as always, I want to thank our sponsors of the show. Our sponsor this week, Suplexes and Microphones, yet another podcast about wrestling. They have some incredible video interviews out there, so definitely go and check those out. Well, gentlemen, today, on our episode last week, we talked about sort of the careers of Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit, and Eddie Guerrero, and kind of how it all culminated with both Benoit and Guerrero winning, the WWE Championship and the World Championship on the same night and celebrating in the ring at WrestleMania 20. Eddie's wife Vicky and Chris's wife Nancy were both watching from a skybox there in the arena. And as we know, this was kind of the height and the peak of the incredible story of kind of really all four of them. But as we know, you know, the it did not stay that way. Things did not stay that way for long at all. And there were a lot of underlying sort of problems that had been really kind of buried and been behind the scenes all along. So what we're going to be discussing today is, how those events impacted the people around them. A lot of those are famous people in the wrestling industry we're familiar with, how they impacted us specifically, and then, Dark Side of the Ring sort of coverage and narrative on all this. Um, so, as we know, after WrestleMania 20, both of these guys kind of set off on their different paths, holding their respective championships. And we talked about how there was a lot of pressure on them from a company standpoint. So, what do you guys think about that out of, kind of the two of them? They had always been under this immense pressure to perform because they were smaller guys. How do you guys think that sort of pressure of having to carry the company would have impacted them?
It would have impacted them a lot because like I said at the end of it, remember we heard probably, the closing remarks of last week were about David Benoit, his son, his comments saying, I wish that they had just retired after WrestleMania 20. And, look at all of what they had to do and look at what they put themselves through. Again, we talked about the chair shots, just again, the Judgment Day chair shot, just one of the hardest chair shots I've ever seen in my life. the feuds that Benoit, had and stuff like that. And of course, he never took it, easy. He always put 100 and, or more than like 1,000% basically into everything. So yeah, the pressure to not only, achieve your goal, but maintain the momentum and maintain everything that you have worked for and not just have it, fizzled out and everything like that. I believe that there was a lot of immense pressure on them. And plus, like, what all was you combine what you have to do on TV, which is physical and emotionally draining enough, and then you have your personal life. We don't know exactly what was going on behind the scenes, like we heard all of this other stuff that they had problems at home, and all this other stuff. So you take all of that, you roll it all into one, and it could cause a person to go insane, basically. you know
I I always we know that wrestling is a predetermined or fixed outcome spectacle of sorts, but one thing that it has in common with like other combat sports is you always hear about certain competitors, whether it be boxing or MMA or whatever, you hear them say things like, it's one challenge to become champion, but it's a whole nother type of challenge maintaining that. And I do think that there is a similarity between that and being a champion within the WWE. So with Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit, they overcame this huge hurdle with them being, smaller guys in the company and becoming the two champions to carry the company on their shoulders. It is one challenge for them to reach that mountaintop, but to stay there definitely proved to be a whole nother challenge altogether. And what we really had was, these guys busting their tails to try to fill the arenas and sell tickets and whatnot. But like we did kind of discuss a little bit in the previous episode, that proved to be difficult, and in certain cases, things kind of faltered for Benoit a little bit and kind of fell flat with his title run. But even still, those guys worked incredibly hard, and it did take a toll on both of them, as we saw.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean, um, as we know regarding Eddie, he worked his ass off. And for instance, when they did the top 15 best SmackDown matches of all time, Eddie Guerrero is featured in five of those 15, including their number one spot, which was a no DQ match with Edge. So
Mhm.
you talk about a workhorse. Um, Now, so let's talk a little bit about Eddie, and kind of his career trajectory. We know that he went through WCW, well New Japan, wrestled in Mexico, New Japan, went through WCW, ECW, back to WCW, and eventually came to WWF. And from that point, he had a lot of nagging injuries. He was taking pain medications, things like that. Now, as someone who has suffered from chronic injury, I can tell you that when you're in pain 24/7, 365, um, pretty much it starts to get to the point where all you can think about is how can you get some kind of temporary relief from that. And I can't imagine the kind of shape his body would have been in after 20 years of wrestling the way he did. And we talked about how he always gave it 100%, more than 100%, every single time. It didn't matter if it was in front of 50 people or 50,000. And so I can only imagine the kind of pain and thing he was dealing with. So he got into alcohol, bad drugs, um, you know, especially like laying on the painkillers and things like that. Vicky Guerrero, and this is an interesting quote. Um, she talks about how she had, he had two different overdoses where she had to call 911 and they took him to the hospital and took care of him and whatnot. And then she said the third time it happened, she just left him there. And so what did you guys think? Because that quote hit me really hard as someone,
Mhm.
as someone who's a mother trying to, basically take care of their family, and then also deal with their husband being a substance abuser and eventually losing his job, which was their source of income. What did you guys think about this quote and this kind of um, segment of the Guerrero family's lives?
It was obviously, a very dark time in Eddie's life. And I think I don't think she did it to be, mean or spiteful or anything like that. It's more of that kind of like, hey, wake up. Like, I saved you, twice, but now it's like, you need to stop this kind of thing. And you need to think about these girls that we have and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, it just it showed like because I've seen the what was it, the resurrection of Eddie Guerrero, the DVD that they did, which
Mhm.
was so compelling that they actually like put it on network television before they did it on DVD, if you guys remember. They put that documentary on because and it wasn't like it was done by WWE, but it wasn't even on like UPN or something. Like it was on like ABC or something like that. I think I can't remember, but I remember watching that, and I didn't realize like how bad that had become for him and stuff like that. And then like when you hear stories of Vicky Guerrero basically saying, "Yeah, I almost let my husband die because it was just like if this is going to be his fate, God, show me now, basically, or something." It's just when someone goes through something like that, there are ways that you have to get through to them, and sometimes they're in very extreme ways, and that just happened to be one of them. And she was getting ready to leave him after that, if
I
I
believe
remember.
they actually did split up for a time.
Yeah, I
Um,
think
and
it
they're and
wasn't
they're a
very long that they split up, but
and they're a very religious family. That's one of the things
Mhm.
that they talked about too was, you know, it was for Eddie, it was God first, and then wrestling was second. Wrestling, well, she said wrestling and family were kind of like right there, neck and neck. What about you, Ace? What did you think about this time period and kind of how the documentary covered it?
Mhm. Yeah. So this was like one of two like kind of major things that I did not know. I didn't know about Vicky, kind of making that decision where, okay, he's overdosed twice now, and I'm gonna leave it in God's hand at this point. Is essentially what she was getting at. Uh, and like I I still own the Eddie Guerrero DVD and also his autobiography, "Cheating, Death, Still in Life," and I've read it multiple times, and it's like I had no idea about that particular instance, and for me, it kind of it took me aback a little bit because one thing you can get from that is that Vicky was tired. She had done what she felt like all she could do, and where do you go with that? She still has two children to take care of. She still has, to take care of herself. And it's like, I think that there comes a point where you're dealing with somebody who suffers from substance abuse where you, as their support beam, you can only do so much. And that person, they need to want it for themselves to maybe get better, and they need to take the other steps so that that support system can really help them. But I think that Vicky was just kind of at her end with that.
Yeah, it's not in his book. And
Yeah.
I've read that too. I've got it laying around here somewhere. And yeah, I mean, and you can tell that Eddie really probably didn't put that in there because he didn't want to portray her in a negative light.
Right.
Yeah, and
Which
it's probably something that she never really told anyone. Like she
uh,
probably just told him. Like, and bet you he probably didn't even know that that happened until like a month later or something like that.
yeah, if ever, I mean, he may not ever have known
Yeah,
about it to be
he
honest.
Hmm.
might not have. That's another thing.
So um, so we go forward a little bit and. And we talked about too, like Chavo. These weren't the only instances of this. Chavo had had to get him together a couple times. They talked about Benoit making sure that he, was on his side so he didn't throw up on himself in the middle of the night. Um, and so this was an ongoing thing. And then, he gets fired. He comes back, has this stellar run. As this beloved WWE champion. Um, so you've got all this, and this leads up to the incredibly unfortunate events of November 13th, 2005, um, where
Mm,
Chavo gets a phone call that his uncle is not responding. Um, and so they go in, they break into the room, they find him in the final moments of his life on the bathroom floor. And as we found out later, this was due to some underlying acute heart disease. Um, and he literally dies in Chavo's arms,
yeah.
which was something I either had forgotten or wasn't aware of until I watched this. I mean, does it? I mean, as a family member and somebody who looked up to Eddie as like a mentor and tagged with him and traveled with him on the road and everything, um, I can't imagine something more tragic for Chavo personally than this. And then he has to tell people on top of it that this is what happened.
I didn't know this either. That I knew that Chavo found his uncle. I had always assumed for all these years that when Chavo found Eddie, that Eddie had already passed. I didn't know that when Chavo found Eddie, that Eddie was still trying to fight for his life, and that he died in his arms. Uh, I mean, yeah, so this was the other thing that just really kind of blew my mind because I never knew. Uh, and I think that I think that Chavo probably just as much as almost anyone else throughout, I would say, these 2 to 3 years had a very rough go of it. Uh, but s- I can't imagine, because he wasn't just Eddie wasn't just Chavo's uncle; it was like his best friend. And so
Hmm.
finding him like that, you know, you don't know what to say to console someone like that. You don't know. Hopefully, you never have to understand how that feels. But it's just one of those things where it's a tragic end to a great man, great wrestler.
Yeah, it was, when I heard that story, I didn't know that that happened, as a child. Well, I couldn't say as a child 'cause by this point I was in high school, I think, when all of this happened. Yes, yes, I was. And, and I remember, like, because here's what sucks to me also now hearing that, and you go back and then you watch, like, footage of, that Raw and Vince McMahon's press conference before that, and Chavo is standing right there, like, through the whole thing, and I'm sitting there going, "Oh my god," like, he just experienced all that, and now he's, having to do all of this other stuff, like, I can't imagine, like, and here was the thing, when I saw the press conference, and the press conference I'm talking about is before the event actually happened and they had to address the media on it or something like that. Um, he like he looked obviously, in terrible, but I didn't realize that like it was that bad. Like I was just like, oh my God. And then hearing the story of it, it's just, yeah, it's and here's what sucks too is he tells everyone that Eddie Guerrero would be talking to people and then he would just kind of pass out and he didn't know that this was going on. It like it happened one time in front of him and I guess he didn't think anything of it or something like that.
Hmm.
Then I guess that is a sign of heart disease or something like that. And you know but what I think even sucks hearing the story as well, makes it even worse is you think about what Eddie's thinking at that moment. He's just going to basically brush his teeth and just something happens and there's nobody around him. There's nothing he can do, like cell phones were not as big as they are now, like they were just starting on that level.
And we
And
don't know that he would have been able to make a call if he had had one anyway.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. Like it's just I think that's the part that really sucks when I think about it. Just you go about doing your daily routines, right? You just because you hear them in the interview, and it's just like, oh yeah, see you tomorrow, man. See you tomorrow. Cool. Like just everything's cool. And then just all of a sudden you're in that moment. You're in Eddie's moment, and it's just like, you know and it sucks because he's probably thinking on the way down like no, my girls, Vicky, everyone. It's just just
Yeah, and he's
heartbreaking.
right, and we don't know what could have been running through
It-
his mind, but I mean, it's just it is
well,
incredibly tragic.
I was just kind of thinking that, I guess, but
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll never know. That's the you know,
Mhm.
um,
It, it did. I'm sorry to interrupt. It
no,
did
go
kind
ahead.
of make me think about, on the Eddie Guerrero DVD. It's so telling because Chavo obviously is on that DVD, and he explains at one point how, with Eddie and his behavior, he was afraid that he would find, his uncle, unresponsive one day. And obviously this is when there was a section of the DVD when Eddie was originally going through his substance abuse. And then, obviously the DVD has a happier ending with Eddie coming through, coming back to the WWE, becoming champion, and has his happy ending in it. But it's just really telling that, Chavo maybe just a few years prior, exclaimed that he was afraid that he would find his uncle in a similar situation to how he did actually find his uncle.
And I mean, let's be realistic about it. Even though he never relapsed and
Mhm.
he, you know, had not, had been off of all the drugs and everything, the toll that he put on his body. I mean, you talk about somebody who's a lifelong professional wrestler, right? Heart disease is not the thing you expect that person to die from. Because we all know that the physical condition that you have to be in to perform on the level that he did, your heart's going to get a pretty damn good workout every single day. I mean, your cardio is going to be amazing. And his
Mhm.
was, but I mean, all the drugs, all the alcohol, I mean, substance abuse in general, not to mention, the steroid use over the years. I mean, that just put him through a lot.
And you
Um,
really don't know how long his drug abuse really was. I mean, some people could say it was this long, but it could have been going on, longer, and people just didn't know about it.
right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about his legacy before we move forward. Um, so in a poll of the WWE roster, he was ranked the 11th greatest professional wrestler of all time.
Mm.
Ric Flair said he was in his top 10 opponents of all time. Now you think about the people that Ric Flair has worked with.
Yeah.
That's basically like saying that you're in the top 10 of all time. Um, Chris Jericho is quoted as saying that when Eddie Guerrero was on, he was the best performer in the world. Kurt Angle named Guerrero as the second greatest professional wrestler of all time, only behind Shawn Michaels, stating that he could have been the greatest of all time. That he had the technique, he had the presence, and he had the ability. So what do you got? I mean, um, we talked a lot in the last episode about kind of the impact that Eddie had on our lives, and kind of our kind of response to him. Um, Do you guys remember exactly where you were when you found out this news that he had passed away?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I do too.
I was I was actually in uh I don't know how tongue this is of me, but I was actually in my parents' basement. Uh and I was on the computer. I was on the dirt sheets, as the kids say. And it was there when I kept seeing like these headlines of Eddie's passing, and I was like, "What? No, that can't be right." And then I kept seeing more and more. And uh, James, I'm sure that you remember, back then we had another friend in our crew, Frankie,
Right?
and I called him up because I knew that Oz was also over there, and so I called Frankie and Oz, and I was just a kid, a teenager at the time, and I said like the dumbest thing ever, and I was like, because I was so dumbfounded by the situation, I said, "Hey, you know Eddie Guerrero, right?" And they were like, yeah, of course, we know Eddie Guerrero." And I go, I think he just died." And they were joking and laughing on the other end, but then it got dead quiet and serious. And they were like, "Are you serious?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they said, "We'll call you back," because at the same time they were looking it up too, and they were also finding reports on it. And it was just one of those things where, like, we as kids who just loved wrestling were really taken aback by something that at the time we had never experienced before.
Right. I mean, it was shocking. It was out of nowhere for all of us.
Yeah, I remember where I was. I was on the computer at my parents' house. Um, and I don't even think I was looking up actually WWE at the time or dirt sheets. I was actually doing schoolwork or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but I remember that my mom came in and she was like, "Hey, did you hear Eddie Guerrero died?" And I went, "What?" Like, no, that can't be. And then sure enough, you go and you turn on like Entertainment Tonight and you turn on I think Fox News at the time as well. And you turn on any of the news that they were saying Eddie Guerrero died. And I was like, oh my God, like what? Like it just you you had no idea that there was anything wrong with him. It just like there was no signs, there was no nothing. It was just so out of left field, and it made you go, oh my god, like you couldn't a wrestling world without Eddie Guerrero, you could not fathom. But unfortunately, it was happening, and at the time when it was happening, it was like, no, this shouldn't be happening now. Like this should be happening, 30 years from now or something like that. But it was devastating, and like I said, I saw a press conference that was on WWE.com, and it was Vince and it was Chavo up there, and they were asking him, so you know. How much is your show changing tonight? He just goes, "Oh, it's changing drastically. Like we're not even performing a show. We're doing a tribute tonight. Like this is like storylines are out the door tonight. Like we're doing a tribute to Eddie." And yeah, I remember watching that and I had tears in my eyes and I was just like, holy crap. And you realize how much impact he had on you, not just as a performer, but as a human being. You could tell he was just a genuine human being.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree. There's a huge, sort of impact on the entire wrestling world for all of this. And then, we talk about kind of the subject of the episode today, and the impact that it had on Chris Benoit and everybody that that talked about it here with Jericho, with Chavo, with Vicky. They all talked about how Benoit was in a lot of ways, he was more shaken up than anybody about it, as if he had lost like a spouse or like a brother or something like that. And I mean, in a lot of ways, he did lose a brother. I'm sure that he looked at it that way, because these guys spent more time together than they spent with their families. They were on the road together every single day, for years and years and years in different countries and different companies. Um, and it changed him. Jericho tells a story that Benoit like was just like sobbing on his shoulder and like cried through his suit jacket, soaked through to the shirt. That's a lot of tears, guys.
Yeah.
Um, so,
And he also tells, the story, how like Benoit, if you go and you look at his, because they had all of the video messages on that Raw and stuff like that for Eddie Guerrero, and you look at like I remember watching Benoit's in the living room live, and I was just like, oh my god, like I bawled at that point. It was just, oh you can tell he is hurting. And you go and you look at that now and you realize, holy crap, you just don't realize how bad, that hurt him. And, Chavo talked about the story of Benoit, just wailing out that huge, just no, kind of thing, like something you would hear in a movie, basically, and it's just, ugh, like,
From a man who rarely showed emotion at
yeah,
that. Mm. Yeah, that was also really heartbreaking as well. Not just Chavo finding his uncle compromised like that, but also hearing about Chavo making that call to Benoit and giving the news to him, and how how rough that was on Chris, on like I said, his best friend who he sees and spends time with every day, works out together. They almost do everything together, and now just like that, without almost any explanation or reasoning behind it, his brother is gone. And I think a lot of people will say that maybe that's when things started to go a little bit downhill for Benoit. He never was able fully to grasp a reality without Eddie in it.
Right. And I mean, that's understandable because
Mhm.
as you said, Caleb, there's a lot of, a lot of us could not imagine a professional wrestling world without Eddie Guerrero in it at the time. And so for this guy who literally was, you know, this was his best friend in the whole world, the impact that it must have had on him was tremendous, especially considering the things that we would discover about Chris Benoit later on, which we'll definitely get into regarding the state of his brain, his mental state at the time. Um, so, let's talk about that. From this moment in time, this is when Jericho and Chavo and a few others, say that this is when Chris Benoit started on his downhill spiral. Where he became really, really isolated. He did not have kind of the same demeanor. He wasn't all over the place backstage. He was just kind of kept to himself. Still showed up to work and did business. Still a professional. Apparently, he went on tour the next day. You know,
yeah,
after the funeral, and
which was
uh,
probably mistake number one.
right, because I mean he was right back out on the road. That's just the kind of professional he was, and he put that
Right.
in front of his personal well-being over and over again for years and years and years. And we see the results of that here. Vicky talks about, things got pretty bad in their home life. That Nancy would call him or call her and check on Chris's well-being when they were on the road and things like that. During this time period. And of course, what's really hard about finding out all this is this was all hidden from us back then, from the public eye. None of us knew. You knew he was hurt, obviously, tremendously by Eddie's passing, but none of us knew that all this stuff was kind of going on behind the scenes leading up to this boiling point.
Yeah, and if you also remember correctly, I mean, he was like Nancy and Chris went over to Vicky's to check on Vicky, and Vicky comes downstairs, and Benoit is literally on Eddie Guerrero's side, holding his pillow, weeping,
Yeah,
like in a fetal position and everything like that. Like I said, I think the mistake number one was, for Chris to go back out on the road just like that. He probably, someone should have been like, hey, you need to just go take a vacation, go with your family, be free for a little bit from this. Don't go because you heard it, like Jericho said it, and I think Chavo even said it, that like Benoit would, go to arenas and he'd be like, Eddie and me were here, last time tearing it up, or this is where I saw Eddie last time. So everywhere he went, he was reminded of Eddie. And then of course, just other complications probably going on. That was when it seemed like the problems in their marriage was really starting to come out.
yeah. And as it goes forward from here, we get to um, June of 2007, so several years after Eddie's passing. Um,
Mhm.
and So at Vengeance in 2007, which is a Night of Champions, Benoit had won a match against Elijah Burke to face CM Punk for the ECW Championship, as it was at the time. Um, all we knew from our perspective was that he didn't show up for the match, that the match didn't go on as planned. He was going to win the title from CM Punk had he been there. Um, but Chavo gets a text from him, and several other people received a similar text saying that Daniel and Nancy had food poisoning, he had to take them to the hospital, and basically he doesn't contact anyone from WWE and say, I'm not going to be able to make it to this event. Um, so were you guys either of you watching or intending to watch Vengeance that night, and do you recall anything about it, from a personal standpoint?
Yes, I remember watching that pay-per-view, strictly for the reason I wanted to see, because I was also a really really big fan of the up and coming CM Punk at the time, and obviously I was a huge big fan of Benoit. I was really looking forward to that matchup, and I see. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it was Johnny Nitro who comes out and faces CM Punk instead, and I'm just bewildered because I was like, I know that this was supposed to be Benoit. This is why I'm watching the pay per view. And so I did think that was strange that we get the build up, the small build up between Punk and Benoit, and then obviously we don't get Benoit here. Uh, I didn't know what to make of it, to be honest, because I mean the WWE didn't know what to make of it, and so there was little to no explanation given to us as the audience as to why we're getting Nitro instead of Benoit. But I do remember that night, and I do remember feeling a little confused and a little upset that I didn't get the match I wanted. But
Yeah. I don't remember the pay-per-view itself basically. I'd actually would have to go back and watch that pay-per-view. I do like I remember that Nitro replaced Benoit. And I believe I read that somewhere. Like I think I read the results for it because still at that time I was not allowed to order pay-per-views like that. Wasn't really until later in life that I really got to order pay-per-views, but I wasn't really able to order pay-per-views like that. So I didn't think anything of it. I just uh, I don't know, like I didn't think anything of it. I didn't plus I didn't follow ECW like that. I liked CM Punk, but I didn't like that ECW. I was like, this is not an ECW for me, like this isn't, the grungy, dimly lit arenas and stuff like that. This isn't um so yeah, I just didn't really watch it and didn't really keep up with it. So I didn't really know all of that was going on. But then I do remember though that Nitro got or replaced someone, and I don't even think I knew it was Benoit. But yeah, so I didn't think anything of it, and then I see this this or I hear Chavo tell the story and everything about how he receives text messages, and it's just him saying that oh yeah, Daniel and Nancy have food poisoning. I need to go take them to the hospital, or I need to go take them to the doctor or something like that. Blah blah blah. Chavo didn't think anything of it. It was it. I wished Chavo, and I think even he wishes this, that because Benoit was just like, "Hey Chavo, I love you, man. I love you so much," and he's like, "Okay, I love you too, brother. Are you okay? Like, is everything all right?" And I think he wishes that he wouldn't have hung up the phone, basically, on that. So
Well, and well,
yeah.
and by that time, I mean, things had already started things had already gone south. So I just want to do a quick. I'll go over the timeline quickly here. Um, on June 19th, which is Tuesday, he has his last match against Elijah Burke on ECW. That
Mhm.
Friday, the 22nd, is when he went home and murdered Nancy in their home. Uh, Basically broke her back in an attempt to suffocate her, wrapped a cord around her neck, um, and just absolutely, brutal, atrocious murder of someone that he claimed to love. By the time he talked to Chavo on Saturday, you know, you know that this guy's clearly snapped at this point. He's murdered his wife. Um, he's calling people, making up these like stories about them being in a hospital, and he's still at this point in time he's contemplating getting on a plane and going to wrestle on Sunday. Saturday is when he gives Daniel the Xanax, sedates him, it suffocates him in his sleep. He's still at this point
Mm.
contemplating going to the pay-per-view. um, Anything they found, search history, the suicide note he left during this time, is just, I mean, it's absolutely the final words of a madman, of a guy who's clearly completely deranged at this point in time. He's murdered his wife, he's murdered his son, he's staying in the house where their bodies are all weekend. And then, finally he leaves the message, "This is my address. The dogs are out back," uh, and doesn't say anything else. And then he finally, commits suicide and kills himself as the last act of this, weekend of absolute tragedy. Um, you know, and WWE and us via them, we don't know that any of this has happened. We just find out that he has passed away. Given what we talked about in the previous episode, about how this man's body of work had impacted our lives up to this point. Um, you know, what was the first thing that ran through you guys' mind when you found out that he had passed away? Before we knew the real story.
Well, I remember because you asked the question about Eddie. Where were we when Eddie died? I remember exactly how I found out about Benoit. I don't know if on that day I had just like not really followed the internet or something like that or whatnot. I don't know, but I remember I turned on Raw, right? And I turned on late. I think I had just gotten home or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but I had turned it on late and it opens up and I see the match and I'm just like, it's Benoit versus Jericho versus Angle at WrestleMania 2000. And I'm just sitting there going, I'm like, wow, is this a highlight or something? Because they would do back in this day, all of that kind of stuff. And so I didn't know what was going on. And I was like, wow, are they doing this whole matchup? Like what is going on here? And then they come out of the matchup because there wasn't anything on the screen yet or anything like that. It was just the match going on. And then they go to Raw where they were supposed to be in the arena and stuff like that. And I hear JR and King talking about Benoit and how he was found in his home dead. And I went, what? Like, wait a minute. No, no, no. This cannot be real. And I just immediately started crying because I was just like, what? Like, you can't be serious. And then like as the show goes on, you see in the bottom, right? You see like in the bottom corner, Nancy, Daniel, and Chris, and all you see is they were found in their home dead, basically. And you're just like, what happened? And then you hear all of the wrestlers, paying tribute to him. And here's my thing: why wouldn't they pay tribute to him at that time? That's their friend. They just lost their best, one of their best friends and stuff like that on the road, especially Chavo, Rey Mysterio. CM Punk was even, talking about how Benoit and he were close and stuff like that. So, um, Triple H even would, spoke highly of Benoit. So why wouldn't they pay tribute? Unfortunately, because here was the thing: no one knew the circumstances. No one. thought in a million years that that was the reason why. And, JR says it, best in the thing. He's like, we didn't have all the facts. Shame on us. Like we maybe we should have waited or something like that. I don't know, but we weren't thinking that at the time. We were thinking we wanted to pay tribute to one of the greatest workers in history. Unfortunately, they just didn't know all of the facts, and no one knew it until 24 hours later. But I remember seeing that all of them were found in their home dead, and I went, hmm, that's not that is not from drug overdose or anything like that. I remember thinking that in the back of my mind going, "Oh, I don't know about this." And something just didn't feel right about it when you saw it. It was just, "Oh, something's not right here." And then 24 hours later, you find out what you find out and you're like, "Oh my god."
It was very hard for me to believe it for years, honestly.
And now hearing the extra details about it, because I thought all of that happened, the day of, and just, that just happened, like, he kills them and then he kills himself basically the day of. That's what I thought. I didn't realize that he was literally sitting there for 4 days basically with his wife murdered and then his son, murdered like 2 days later or something like that. I just went, "Oh my god." Like, you know, it just ugh, like, yeah.
I think for me, oddly enough, I had a friend call me up and inform me that he had heard of Benoit's passing, and he called me because he knew that how big of a Benoit fan I was, and I was like, "What? No, that's not true." Like I didn't believe it,
Mhm.
and I went back to the computer and I did some searching myself, and I kept seeing these reports, but I was in denial. I didn't want to believe it. I was like, nope, this isn't true. Like these people don't know what they're talking about, and I couldn't wait for Raw that night. And then Raw comes on, and as soon as I see the empty arena and Vince McMahon standing in the middle of the ring, that's when I knew, like, oh no, like this is real. And I remember feeling obviously very, very sad and also a little angry because in my young mind at the time, none of this made any sense. It didn't add up. And just like everyone else, no, I didn't know the details of what had happened. But, I think that's kind of the other thing about WWE's and Vince's decision to do that tribute show, which was as far as they had knew, the police report said one thing at the time, and
Right.
so they put on the tribute show, and then some 26 hours afterwards, more news is released as to what really happened. I don't think that the WWE is to blame for putting on that tribute show based off of the information that had been given to them from the police. So, yeah.
Right. I agree entirely, and I think
Yeah.
we can blame WWE for a lot of things, but I think they're in the clear on this one. Um, I think William Regal was like the only person that really suspected something had happened, something nefarious had taken place because he very carefully watched the words that he used, and I remembered that when Jericho talked about it, it kind of brought it back to my mind is like how chilling and different his speech kind of was because he was hesitant to say anything other than that about his body of work that he was the greatest in ring performers of all time, and he left it at that. And seeing some of the other comments that some other people made, especially Chavo,
Oh,
that's got to haunt him forever.
Mhm.
Um, and he's not to blame for that either.
no,
Um,
because again, that was one of his best friends, and he didn't know he was capable of anything like that. That
yeah,
would be like that would be the equivalent to, if like my best friend, right now was just to go off the hinges, like it would be like I had no idea that that was happening or anything like that. He just thought he was normal or something like that, and it's just yeah, it was just a really bad situation.
and it goes. you know, kind of further to, we talk about Sandra, who we haven't talked a lot about, who was Nancy's sister, and kind of the impact that it had on her when she got out of the movie and found out about all this. And she had been right there kind of through all of this from the beginning of their relationship. And, even she talks about him being one of the best of all time, even though he murdered her family, and that's both horrifying and a testament to him as a person and to his body of work. If we're looking at those as two separate things, which we have to, you
Mhm.
know, we have to. There's no other way to to look at it. And either that or you just got to do what the WWE has been doing since then, and just you don't mention them at all. Um, so the part of we've talked a lot about how these have impacted us. The part of these documentaries that impacted me the most is when David talks about receiving the phone call about his father. Um, I was about his age when my father passed away, and I have gotten that phone call. And so when he talked about the way he felt when he got it, when he received that call, um, I felt that on an incredibly personal level, and it's I can't imagine what he's had to go through since then because all of this was in a very public eye, and his father is going to go down in history as a murderer and this awful human being. And we say that that's not the person we knew. That's not. I mean, this is this guy's dad. It's not the person he knew. He couldn't fathom it. So of course everybody else in his life didn't see this coming.
And I think one thing that's actually a very scary thought is you're really glad that David was not anywhere near there that weekend because I, you know, who knows what would have happened there.
I want to note too that what's interesting is they're actually so I guess she declined to be in the documentary, or maybe they asked him about this. But he also has a daughter, Megan, and she was not mentioned at all.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the story is there or why.
No, I'm not sure either. I mean, I'm sure we can all imagine maybe as to why she possibly wouldn't want to be on it. Uh, but I think as far as David goes, we may have even echoed this in the previous episode, but he definitely had a hard go of it. I mean, for multiple reasons. One is it's a media frenzy, and whether it was Jericho or JR who mentioned it earlier, the media loves being able to take shots at professional wrestling whenever they can, anyway. And seeing this tragic and horrific event take place, David idolized his father. Chris was his hero, and I mean, like I don't know what David could what he could be thinking in that situation, or even how do you feel in that situation. I can't even fathom, but I do know that it had to be heartbreaking for several reasons. He lost his father and his hero figure, but not only that, but it was under the circumstances in which he lost him and his entire and most of his family.
Yeah, I mean, he had dreams of becoming a professional wrestler himself,
Mhm.
and of course he can't do that now. Um, there'll be that stigma that will follow him for the rest of
Mhm.
his life, unfortunately. And yeah, I mean, it was hard for him. He broke down at one point during the interview, and I don't blame him. This is the first time that him or Sandra has spoken publicly about this. Um, they've mostly had to kind of deal with it ever since then. And it's been a really long time. It's been 13 years. Um,
Yeah, and I was gonna, I was even thinking about that while watching the documentary because I remember Benoit saying, in his WWE DVD that he had children, not just a son. Like he had children from his previous marriage, and I was always just like, well, then where's the other child? Like, is it like how many children did he have? Kind of thing. So I don't know, maybe she just wants to wipe all memories of him away or something like that. I really don't know. I mean, that's oof. I cannot imagine what other people outside, like in the Benoit family, in the I guess Toffoli family, what all they were thinking. I mean, you saw that like it took 13 years for David and Sandra to reconnect, and it took Chris Jericho of all people, which is again why I say he is the GOAT. He is an amazing person for that. But yeah, and the fact that people are so cruel when it comes to anything nowadays. And something like this that was such a media frenzy. I mean, he had to go to school, the very next day, and people are looking at him like he's to blame. Like, oh, that's the child, or that's the child of a murderer. He's psycho now, kind of thing. I can only imagine what they were saying to him and how he must have felt. Like hearing that pissed me off. Like I was just like, that's absolutely asinine for anyone to do that to that kid right there. And I hope that he had those like two or three friends that he could count on that would be there for him and everything like that through all that. But um and that was the thing. Chris Jericho said it. The family was basically blackballed from the world, not just wrestling, but the world. Like it was just like, Benoit, his one, this horrible act that he portrayed, or this not portrayed, but this horrible act that he committed, it blackballed his entire family, and they had nothing to do with it. Like they're innocent in all of this, but people are just cruel and everything like that, and the media and like you said, Ace, the media loves to take shots at wrestling. They love it. I don't know why. I've never understood it. I've never understand why they hate wrestling so much, but whatever. And so basically, and Jericho even said it, what Benoit did, he almost brought down the business. Like he literally did. Like a lot of wrestlers were almost like, I don't want to go down this road.
And I mean, speaking of things we can blame WWE for, before we get into our last couple topics here, is the Vince McMahon's instant try to attempt to spin all this in the media that the wellness policy is not for blame, even though he had like 10 times the normal amount of testosterone in his body. They estimated he had never stopped using steroids. I mean, apparently, by all intents and purposes, the wellness program at the time was a joke. Um, and there's that's definitely changed now, right? But I mean, there's significant evidence that it was a joke. Obviously, didn't catch any of this stuff. Do we know that if it had, that things would have turned out differently? Maybe not, because of course, originally this was all attributed to steroid use. Um, Now, as we found out later, so there's two guests that joined in the documentary at this point, and they definitely have different agendas.
Oh, I can't
So
wait for this.
yeah, so the first guy we have is Matthew Randazzo, who's the author of Ring of Hell, the story of Chris Benoit and the fall of the pro wrestling industry. And then the other person we have is Chris Nowinski. Now, both of them are seemingly very interested in finding out the real cause of why this could have transformed this sort of gentle man into someone who would brutally murder his family. But we look at they both have separate agendas here. Like Chris Nowinski obviously has a reverence for pro wrestling and was doing this out of a care for the Benoit family and for his other colleagues who probably do suffer from CTE and have had multiple concussions. And then there's also I think Randazzo was looking at it from a perspective to kind of promote his book and kind of the narrative of that book and trying to kind of make a dollar off of it. Because if you look at kind of the other things he's written, they're all sort of these like shock pieces about different industries and things like that. What did you guys think about these two speakers?
Oh, let me start with Matt Randall. How do you say his last
It's
name?
Randazzo.
Okay, Randazzo. Yeah, I just He's one of those guys. He's one of those, I guess, news people or reporter type guys. I guess that when he writes a story, he thinks what he is saying is complete true, and that this is what actually happened and everything like that. And I'm just like, dude, can you just shut up? Like, um, and the whole his book, The Fall of Pro Wrestling, okay, has he seen it lately? Kind of thing. So I don't know where he gets that. It just seemed like his whole narrative throughout the whole thing was this was caused by wrestling. That was what it was. Even if it had to do with the steroid abuse, with the CTE, he's like, he basically said, Harley Race invents the flying headbutt, does it, tells everyone this will mess your spine up, don't do it. Dynamite Kid does it, ends up in a wheelchair, tells Benoit, don't do it. Benoit still does it, kind of thing. And I'm just like, ugh, like, basically he said at the end of it, this was going to happen either way because Benoit a long time ago chose to follow his dreams or something like that. And I was just like, and excuse my language, but fuck you. Like, really? Like, come on. That just that's BS to me. So his to me his clear agenda in all of this is not only to destroy Benoit's legacy, which I mean is already destroyed. Let's be honest, but it's to destroy wrestling. Like it's just to take shots at wrestling, and I'm just for the life of me, I'm just like why, kind of thing. But Chris Nowinski, I like that he came in, and I don't think he was, really saying that this could be the only thing of why Benoit, snapped and everything like that, but he's saying it definitely was a cause of it and stuff like that. And the research that he's done and the people that he's helped, since leaving the WWE and stuff like that. He's I applaud Chris Nowinski. And actually, someone I remember watching around 2002 and stuff like that. I thought he had a lot of potential, but unfortunately, he got injury prone, and that's why he started doing what he did. But yeah, both of them definitely had different agendas, and one was more noble than the other. And that's just my opinion. I don't know if y'all feel like that or anything like that, but that was how I took it.
Yeah, and I want to add that Chris Nowinski is the co-founder and the executive director of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, so he's kind of made this his sort of life's work. And he did state that Benoit's brain had essentially started to rot from within while he was still alive. That kind of led to this drastic change in who he was as a person.
Right. Uh, I think for me, it's like Mr. Randazzo, like his approach to the situation. I think maybe it could potentially come from a place of good intentions. The narrative he paints though is almost damning of pro wrestling and what it does. And just kind of in retrospect to his perspective and also the media's take, I did find it kind of ironic how the media always loves to criticize wrestling, whether they want to paint the narrative of it's this silly thing that's quote unquote fake or predetermined. But then when they look at the side of things where the injuries pile up and the CTE being the potential cause of this tragedy, now they want to paint it as this dangerous thing, and it's almost like, well, which is it? Because you can't do both. Uh, but as far as Matthew's take goes with it, he he does lean heavily into pro wrestling being the super dangerous thing where steroids run rampant and that's the cause or the trigger for Benoit to commit these atrocities. And I won't sit here and pretend to be an expert on CTE or steroids, but even with an arbitrary understanding, a little bit of both, it's like uh, what Benoit did is way more in line with severe CTE than a roid rage. And while I don't agree with Vince getting out in the public and trying to defend his wellness policy to the media, one thing Vince said that did actually make a lot of sense is what Benoit did was deliberate, and roid rage, traditionally speaking, is something that happens in a moment, in an instant. You know, it's something that takes place very quickly. It happens and then it's gone. Whereas what Benoit did was something that was very malicious and thought out. Um, but one thing also really quick with Christopher Nowinski, uh, I applaud that man for his research and for his work, because it's not only has brought to light the potential dangers of like chair shots and head injuries in pro wrestling, but also of course football as well, and other combative sports where there's a lot of potential head injuries. So he's done amazing work, and what he found in Chris Benoit's brain, I thought was just it was very telling of the entire situation.
And
Yeah, and
and to this day,
Vince
WWE, right now, if you have a concussion, in your medical history on record, odds are they're not going to take you when it comes to recruiting people right now. For the sake of not putting their personal business out there, I'm not going to go into it, but there's definitely some notable indie talent that have basically would have made it there were it not for the fact that they have a concussion on record.
Nigel McGuinness.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, the person's name I wasn't going to put out there is somebody a little more personal, intimate to us. But like I said, not going to get into that. But there's several. It's a lot of it.
And it's interesting too because Vince even question you know not necessarily the CTE thing, but they're like, why would you let him do duties like this? And he was just like, he performed them like they were nothing still. Like if we had known something was wrong, he wouldn't have been able to do or to perform in the ring, and Benoit still performed in the ring, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is we're kind of getting over the timeline here. So what we need to do then is go into our final thoughts and kind of wrap this one up. So Caleb, I'll let you go first. What's kind of your overall kind of final thoughts on this pair of episodes?
Ooh, so I'm glad that Dark Side of the Ring is the first ones to really tell this story publicly. Because had it been anyone, had it been a Hollywood movie, which we've heard several are trying to be in the works, if it had been, a CNN or a Fox News type of story, like this, then, we would not get the full story. And I think if anything, this episode shows that this needed to happen for not just the story's sake, but also as it was very therapeutic for Jericho, Malenko, Sandra, and David and Chavo, because they had not been able to say a word. They had not been able to talk to anyone. They had not been able to, discuss Benoit. And they were like, wait a minute, like, Jericho even says it. He's like, I need to talk about this. I have to get this off my chest because if I don't, um, I'm gonna go crazy, kind of thing. So it was very therapeutic for them, and I'm glad that they were able to get a lot of stuff off of their chest. It's just I pretty much look at it like Dean Malenko says. I think you can say that Benoit was one of the greatest workers of all time, and then leave it at that. There's just really nothing else to say. But I believe, in which they addressed at the end of this episode, was um, I believe that woman should be inducted into the Hall of Fame because she didn't do anything wrong. Her legacy should not be tarnished. Yes, could that bring up, if she's nominated, what happened and everything? Yes, it could, and it probably will, but it would not be glorifying Benoit or anything like that. It would be glorifying her because she was a pioneer in that role. She was one of the first like real female managers next to like Sherry Martell and Miss Elizabeth. She ranks right up there and stuff like that. So I believe that she deserves to go into the Hall of Fame. And Benoit, I agree with Jr. No, he shouldn't be inducted into anything because um, all it's going to do is bring up the last, and not really 24 hours of his life, but really the last 4 days of his life, to be quite honest, which are just absolute horrible to think about. It's just, and we will never know why. People can say CTE, steroid abuse, all this other stuff. We will never know why Benoit chose to do what he did. And quite frankly, I don't want to know. You know,
Right. We can't
Like,
we can't explain the inexplicable. Even if he were here to be able to tell us, it's not like it would make anything any better. Maybe even worse. Um, Ace, what are your final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so really quick, I do think that with the release of these couple of episodes here, we do have to definitely give a special shout out to like Chris Jericho and Chavo, especially because they were like the only two people from the WWE who even tried to reach out to David, and it's kind of a shame because there were a lot of people who knew Chris and who were close to the situation and who also knew Nancy as well. And so I do think it's really great of those guys to do what they did to try to, I guess help provide a shoulder to lean on during those trying and hard times. Uh, Also, I wanted to point out a couple of things that Jericho said that were just cut to the bone. Like, when he mentioned the fact that if Benoit, like, he had to have been out of his mind because surely Benoit, he in the professional sense of things, Benoit held wrestling to the highest esteem, and there's no way that in his right mind Benoit would ever do anything to jeopardize his wrestling legacy or wrestling in general. And the fact
mhm.
that his act of atrocity almost brought that down entirely shows you that clearly there was something going on here. There was something severely wrong. Uh, and you also look at the fact that what you said earlier, Caleb, about how woman should be inducted into the Hall of Fame, and that's also something that Jericho mentioned, and he also at the same time brought up a kind of a difficult point, which is WWE being who they are and wanting to distance themselves from the Benoit name. He's like he would love to hear them induct Nancy Benoit, but how do you even say her name?
Yeah.
And so there's just a whole lot of ugly red tape to kind of go through, but I do hope that one day we can get Nancy in. uh, and yeah, as a whole, I mean, just like the both of you have already mentioned, Benoit is one of the greatest in ring performers of all time. uh, Nothing will ever change that. And I think that when we all look at Benoit, we all look at his body of work in the ring, the last few days of his life. I think we all choose to kind of separate that from the man that we saw on TV every week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think also, Jericho mentioned it as well that, and I definitely believe it after hearing the story. I believe Benoit's fate was sealed when Eddie died. That's basically when he deteriorated. That was when he lost just all sense of purpose in life or something like that. And it's awful. It was a terrible situation. But and I don't mean this in any way, but it is what it is. And it's just what sucks about it. And Jericho said it also as well that you can't even say Benoit's name anymore. Like it's like just even saying it, it's like ugh, like I get this weird feeling in me and everything. So it's like it sucks because Eddie Guerrero's legacy is very acclaimed. Everyone praises Eddie as one of the greatest of all time, and Benoit is just, you know,
Yeah,
can't even say anything.
and I agree. I mean, I think that woman should definitely be in the Hall of Fame. If they want to put her in there, obviously it's going to come up, but they could use her maiden name. They can use her stage name. They don't have to mention those events. I think she definitely deserves to be in there, and I'm hoping that one day she will be. As much as I once felt otherwise about it, because when you're a fan of somebody your whole life and it doesn't matter what they do, you want to see them honored for it. But I mean, I agree now that he should never be in the Hall of Fame.
Mm-mm.
I if anything, maybe 30 years from now, his matches can be on the network again. But it's it's really to the point where you just don't, they want to distance themselves from him entirely,
Well,
and I
they,
and
I
I don't blame them.
mean, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
Okay.
they are, up on there, but it's like you can't search Benoit,
Right.
basically.
Yeah, they've gone to extensive lengths to erase him, and I don't blame them from a corporate standpoint. I really don't.
I really
Um,
don't.
yeah, I mean, with that, that's basically going to wrap this one up. I appreciate both of you guys joining me for this one. This is very heavy content to have to get on here and talk for an hour about. Definitely thanks for joining us, Ace, for both of these episodes. Um, uh, Go ahead and tell everybody where they can, if they really enjoy hearing your voice, where else they can hear it.
Yeah. First of all, thank you again, both of you, for having me on. This has been a blast. Even despite it being such heavy content, I love talking about this with the two of you. So thank you for having me on as your very first guest. But if you guys do like the sound of my voice and you also like nerdy topics such as superheroes, comic books, etc., then you guys can hear me and also my good friend Kevin at the Superhero Homies podcast. We are wherever podcasts are, whether that be Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever podcasts are. Also, we do have a Patreon page as well. You guys can support us if you like to. That is patreon.com/superhero homies, where we discuss other nerd topics and movies and television shows and whatnot. Also, video games. And on top of that, if you guys want to reach out to us, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All of it is at Superhero Homies. So
We definitely appreciate you being here. And as always, I want to thank my co-host Caleb Stovall. Caleb, if they like the sound of your voice, which is probably not likely, but tell them where else they can hear it.
Oh. Well, they can find me on SWN, the Stovall Wrestling Network podcast, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, all that stuff. And we talk about pro wrestling, of course. We talk about, though, what's going on currently, past events, and what could happen in the future and stuff like that. So, it's always fun. I love talking about pro wrestling. It's my favorite thing in the world, and I care not what anyone says on that. So,
I'm gonna get my own plug in. You can also hear either one of these guys on commentary for Viral Pro Wrestling, and you can find all that content on the SOS Customs Wrestling Network. I'm James Caleb Kitchens, and this has been an Evolved Review.